I was raised in freezing temperatures. I didn't grow up in the Arctic. I didn't grow up in Alaska. I grew up right here in St. Louis. And today, my wife and I are working very hard to raise our children in freezing temperatures too. And every day when I go to work, a lot of what I do is about making sure that all of our children grow up freezing. Now that's going to sound odd. To help you understand what I mean about that, I need to tell you a little bit about water. Water is essential to all life on Earth, but it's also a pretty remarkable substance in its own right. A little over 70% of the Earth's surface and 60% of an adult human body is water. And water is also the only substance on Earth that comes in liquid, solid, and gas forms. Now, of course, water in its solid form is ice. And ice is pretty remarkable too. Ice is the only substance on the Earth that's lighter in its solid form than in its liquid form. As you can see, ice floats to the top of water. A solid piece of steel dropped into a vat of molten steel wouldn't do that. It would sink. When water freezes at or below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it expands. But not only does it expand, the hydrogen and oxygen molecules line up in a very orderly fashion with lots of space in between. It's called a hexagonal crystal lattice because of the six-sided shape of the structure. And that structure, with all this space in between, is what allows ice to float to the top of water. It's what makes ice less dense than water. Now, the lightness of ice should not be confused with weakness. Ice is quite strong, as anyone who's seen Titanic or tried to scrape the stuff off after an ice storm can attest. But an interesting thing happens when you put water under pressure. The temperature actually has to be colder in order for the water to freeze. Now, I'm not telling you any of this because I'm a chemist or a physicist. I'm actually a psychologist trained in public health. And I'm not telling you because ice and water are so intrinsically interesting, although they are. I'm laying the foundation for an analogy that explains a central concept in American life: individual effort. There's hardly anything more central to the American belief system than a belief in individual effort, or the proverbial bootstraps by which all of us are supposed to pull ourselves up. In fact, we often believe that most of life's outcomes are the result of an individual's hard work, persistence, and drive. And this belief has been the source of spectacular feats and great triumphs in many fields of endeavor. But it's only a partial explanation of how life outcomes actually work. Individual effort is like water. It's absolutely essential to a successful, productive life. But no matter how hard water works, it will never be ice without freezing temperatures. And when water is under pressure, those temperatures need to be even colder. There are a great many people under pressure in the United States today. And we often blame them for not being good enough water, for not working hard enough or trying hard enough. But we don't as often ask about those freezing temperatures that provide the context for water to take on its orderly, solid form of ice and float easily to the top of even the purest water. In science, we talk about conditions being necessary but not sufficient for some outcome. Water is necessary but not sufficient for ice. You can't get ice without water, But you also can't get ice with just water. You need the context of freezing temperatures to make water into ice. And the context also is needed in order to have a healthy, productive, successful life. You need a supportive context that freezes the water of individual effort into ice. And that's how I can claim to have been raised in freezing temperatures. I grew up in the safe, comfortable environs of West St. Louis County. I have exceptional parents who provided my brother, my sister, and me with love, support, and structure. And that allowed my water to freeze into ice. It allowed me to be successful in grade school, and then a top college prep high school, and go on to Harvard, and then graduate school twice, and end up as a faculty member at one of the best universities in the country. And a lot of people praise the water. And there was a lot of individual effort. There was a lot of hard work, to be sure. But I thank my parents, my teachers, my mentors, my coaches for freezing me to life. And I wish all children could grow up freezing. But I know firsthand that they do not. I've been working for a little over 2 years on a project called For the Sake of All that's been taking the temperature here in St. Louis, the temperatures at which we expect people to develop in our region. And what we've concluded is that for some people, in some parts of our region, a deep freeze exists. And for others, it's like the heart of a scalding St. Louis summer all year round. For the Sake of All is a project about the health and well-being of African Americans, but it's also a story about how we're all connected to one another and how the lingering disparities in our region impact everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. This has become one of the most famous graphics in the report. We found an 18-year gap in life expectancy between 63105 in Clayton and 63106 in North St. Louis City. That's a geography of less than 10 miles, but the temperatures are very different in those zip codes. 63106 in North City has almost 8 times the poverty rate, 6 times the unemployment rate, a quarter of the median income of 63105 in Clayton. 63106 is almost 95% African American, which is 10 times the African American population in 63105. Health and life itself are not equally distributed throughout the St. Louis region. Those freezing temperatures that provide the context for living a healthy life are not equally distributed either. And easily one of the saddest manifestations of that reality is the fact that an African American infant is 3 times more likely to die before their first birthday than a white infant in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. We also know that adult deaths usually are accounted for by the leading causes like cardiovascular disease and cancer and diabetes. But we can also link social factors like poverty and low levels of education to mortality rates. We were actually able to estimate the number of deaths among African American adults in 2011 that were related to these 2 social factors. We estimate that 305 deaths were due to poverty and 263 deaths were due to having less than high school education. And to put that in some St. Louis context, that's enough people to fill more than 7 Metrolink cars. Now, people always ask, well, don't people actually die of chronic diseases? Of course they do. But we know from several decades of study that these social factors are also pretty consistently and strongly linked to rates of death. In fact, one analysis showed that if we gave everyone the education of the college educated, it would save more lives than all the medical advances of the last 20 to 30 years combined. Now, this association between social factors and health outcomes isn't new to those of us in public health. In fact, the relationship is so strong and so consistent that we have a name for it. It's called the socioeconomic gradient in health. And this is just one picture of the gradient, one way of illustrating this gradient. What this is showing you is that at every step up the family income ladder, your risk of premature death decreases. And you could graph this with any number of factors. This could be education or wealth. But what we find in terms of education is a gap that has been widening over the past several decades. What this graphic is showing you is that those who have high school or less education between 1990 and 2000 gained absolutely 0 years of life expectancy, compared to those who had any college or more education, gaining a little over a year and a half of life expectancy. And once again, placing this within St. Louis context, we know that whites are more likely to have some college or more, at 73%, and African Americans are more likely to have high school or less, at 46%. In fact, in a single year, 2012, 1 in 10 African American 9th through 12th graders dropped out of school. That was roughly 2,000 young people in a single year. And all of this has a considerable economic impact on our region. Those deaths that we estimated to be due to poverty and low levels of education in a single year have an economic impact of $4 billion in St. Louis. If just half of those 2,000 young people had graduated from high school, they would have made $11 million more in income per year, spent $21 million more on home purchases, added $15 million to our gross regional product, and added $1.1 million to state and local tax revenue. We spend $1.1 billion every year on hospital care for just 3 conditions: heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. Again, for St. Louis context, that's like building 3 Edward Jones domes every year. By cutting the disparity between African Americans and whites, eliminating that disparity, we would save $65 million as a region. Now, we're not going to solve these disparities, these lingering gaps in our region, by just providing more and better medical care. That's another one of those factors that's necessary but not sufficient for the problem ahead of us. We need to change context and provide resources like education and jobs and wealth, and change contexts like schools and neighborhoods. And we have to start very early, in the earliest years of life, by providing high-quality early childhood development for all children in our region. We also need to make sure that working families have an opportunity to live and save for their future, and to make a livable wage to support their families. We have to do better at supporting children in schools, looking to their health and well-being, including providing school-based health care within the school setting. The emotional health of children and adults is a problem that we need to address here in our region and throughout the country. And no matter where you live in St. Louis, you ought to have the context, the freezing temperatures, that allow you to live a healthy life. That means a safe neighborhood, affordable housing, and access to amenities like grocery stores and banks and parks. And finally, we have to address health care where health actually happens. As the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation says, where we live, learn, work, and play. And we also have to attend more to preventing disease before it happens, and when disease happens, connecting clinical settings like doctors' offices and hospitals back to the community. So we have a lot of work to do in St. Louis to address these problems before us. And our very future depends on us doing this work. If you're interested in how you can be involved in this, you should visit our website, forthesakeofall.org, where you can read the full report, but you can also read and download discussion guides and action toolkits that turn our recommendations into tangible actions that you can take. You can get involved. You must get involved. Ultimately, we have to remove the pressure. We have to turn down the temperature. And we have to allow all of our children and all of our families to float to the top. I believe that we can. I'm the product of freezing temperatures, and I know what they can do. Thank you.